I think the background is not necessary, but let me make a statement first that my popular impression is that the more we have as involvement from the EU, the more people expect that policies in Europe will look more or less the same. With the explosion of all kind of, let's say, directives, especially after the last treaty changes, this feeling has become a kind of general impression at the public, but also partly in the literature. And of course, there are very nice examples out there which indicate that this might be true. And I think the most extreme example is EMU, or let's say all the policies which are connected to the introduction of the euro, which more or less require that there's one monetary policy in the whole of Europe over 50 member states. And this policy should be the same. Although at the moment, if you read carefully newspapers, it's clear that there are little bursts, little cracks already occurring, in the sense that Portugal is having a deficit of about 4.5%, which is 1.5% too high. But also Germany, France, but maybe even the Netherlands in a few years may have difficulty in sticking to this uniform policy. Well, I'm not going to talk about the EU anymore, but raise a question and try to solve a kind of puzzle. And the puzzle is this expectation correct or not? And if it's not correct, what could be the reasons for this? Well, let's have a look first at some of the older empirical research. It's not completely up to date, but it gives you at least some impression about what is went on. And just, let's say, a couple of studies. We have the work, for example, of PDT on air pollution, comparing UK with Germany, and a conclusion coming out of this study is that there is, let's say, both a kind of tendency to becoming more or less the same, let's call this convergence, but at the same time all kind of differences between these countries remain to exist. So, to make a first conclusion and to come up with first results, it's not clear, and it doesn't exist, and not clear and unambiguous, the typo here on my sheet, trend towards convergence in the EU policy, and there is, to my knowledge, no systematic explanation yet, which may give you a clue what's going on. And I would like to try to make a little push here in analyzing this issue further, a push by focusing on two different aspects. And the aspects are, first of all, the question about the legislative design. If you, for example, have a policy which allows for differences in implementation, for example, that could be a cause of divergence, differences between national interpretations of the policy. The second instance, even if there is one directive indicating a certain policy to be implemented, the question is how implementation goes. And the second factor, therefore, is the implementation at the national level of that policy. How is it implemented by the member states, and do incentives exist which may cause for differences? Just to give you some additional information, in the case of the first factor, we would like to focus on the decision making in the Union, decision making in the Council of Ministers, and there's a different, one may call it push and pull factors, although they differ a little bit from the push and pulls Tanya was talking about may exist. A pull factor for, or a push factor for more similarity may exist in the fact that the Council mostly wants to decide by using consensus. Even if qualified majority rule is the rule, they nevertheless would like to have consensus out there, although this is less strict nowadays than a few years ago. At the same time, of course, and my analysis will point to that, there may also exist good reasons not to go for this and to allow for certain differences between the member states. But that's the question we might address in a moment. If we focus on the national implementations, First of all, in the literature, the expectation is that, and here I have a rather aggressive citation from me, is that maybe member states try to claw back, he calls it, at the basis what they lost at the summit, saying so much that member states may want to take a little bit away from the policy as agreed upon by the member states and fill it and implement it in a way they like better, since the common policy, the policy they agreed upon, is a result which they didn't appreciate very much. And of course, the constraints there is the monitoring by the European Commission. Tanja talked about it, but also the monitoring by the European Court of Justice in Luxembourg, or the national courts for that matter. So seeking for national deviations, of course, means a tool towards more differentiation. And the question is how this will work out. Let's start with the first factor, legislative design. And the question here is why and when do member states obtain exemptions? Why and when do member states want to have differences in a common policy? So the first assumption is that the current state of affairs is not homogeneous for the member states. Now there exist differences in the way in which they have set their national policies, and therefore this may cause for some problem. Well, the problem for the member states then to decide on a common policy, using in this case unanimity rule, but of course we can also, if you like, do it with qualified majority rule, but that makes things a little bit more complicated. And I think it might be nicer to focus on the dynamics instead on the complications. In view of different preferences, they have different preferences, and thus the different status quo points. Let me just explain first the notation, because some of you may have had this in one of the courses in the institutional stream, but others may not. So let me make clear first what things mean. Well, first of all, we have three member states, and member states are indicated as N1, N2, and N3. And nation 1, nation 2, nation 3. And those nations, member states, have different preferences on a certain scale. Nation 1 prefers the policy about here, nation 2 about there, and nation 3 about here. So they differ with regard to what they would like to have. For example, if this is a directive on clean air, it could be that nation 1 is satisfied with lower standards than nation 2, and nation 2 is satisfied with slightly lower in comparative terms standards than nation 3. 3 wants the highest, 2 is intermediate, and 1 is the one who can live with a lower standard in this case. Okay, those are the nations. Now what about the other notation there? Well, they, in this example, have different national policies somehow. And the national policies are indicated with this Q. Q3 stands for the national policy which was implemented at that moment by the nation number 3, and 1 is the national policy. Q1 is the national policy of N1, the first nation, and finally we have here the policy good Q2, which is the national policy on clean air, in that case by nation number 2. So those are the starting points for those nations if they come together in Brussels and discuss the possibility of moving towards a common policy in the EU on that matter. So the question arises, would they go for a common policy, a change, or would they stick to their national policies? In that case, one would like to see whether an improvement is appreciated by all three of those different member states. And the improvements they would like to, which they would favor, are indicated by those lines. Those lines give in sections on this interval, on this sections, on this dimension of positions they prefer to their own national policy. So in the case of nation number 3, given this rather extreme status quo point, this nation prefers all the points between Q3 and this points to Q3. It gives points this nation refers to Q3. In the terminology introduced in the institutional scheme is called a preference set. It's the set of points referred to point Q3. Okay. Well, the same holds for a nation 1. The orange interval is the position which nation 1 likes more than its initial policy at the domestic level, and the same holds for nation number 3 with regard to the brown interval. Okay, so we have now 3 intervals, orange, brown and green, and the question is whether they come together and add up to a common policy. But in this case it doesn't, clearly, and there's no overlap between those intervals. And you can clearly see that orange and brown do not overlap, and this is a problem. Why is this a problem? Well, for EU decision making is a problem because those member states may not go for a common policy because they have disagreements. They are divided and are not able to move the whole thing to one uniform policy at EU level. And there doesn't exist a policy as such which satisfies all the member states in the sense that this policy is better than what we can do at the domestic level. Okay. Now just an example of the opposite. And just to give you a sense about what this means. If you, for example, have this configuration here, and now the initial starting points are all shifted a little bit away to one side, clearly there exists an interval, exist possibilities for the member states to come up with a common policy. There exist some points which they all prefer to their national policy in that area. And it's in the area where there's the overlap of the green, the brown, and the orange intervals. Going back in the case where they, as such, cannot come up with a common policy as such, might be the case that they can only, they cannot find a common policy which satisfies all of them. What they could do is decide on a policy which sets some minimum standards, for example by choosing a policy from the orange interval, at the same time granting exceptions to the other member states which may want to like to have a higher standard to go ahead without being restricted to this rather limited policy at the EU level. In other words, only if you allow for exemptions to arise to work with minimum standards and so on, you are able to find a policy able to make a policy at the EU level in those circumstances. And that might be also the reason why you have different ways in which sometimes policy are being framed, and the possibilities of opt-outs, where you have higher standards and exemptions for some member states to maintain lower standards. You have the possibility of having using minimum standards, where some others are allowed to go on and implement rather high standards, like the Danes in the environmental area. And of course you have the more general safeguards clauses in between. So differences in policy here actually are a consequence of legislative design. So some of the differences which you may find in the Union are just a way of avoiding problems which I just illustrated with my rather simple model. Okay, let's have a look at the second factor. The second factor is national implementation. And the question is, to which extent will member states implement directives differently? Is this something which is automatically the case? No, of course. You've heard the lecture by Tanya, which clearly indicates that differences do exist, but how does it work? And to which extent does it affect the final shape of the policy? Here again, I would like to introduce a very simple model in order to give some ideas and to show how it may work with regard to implementation. Again, we use different actors, in this case actors at the national level. Secondly, we assume that these actors have to cooperate, and this nicely fits to a comment made also by Akem and Jay about veto players. They act as veto players in the sense that they need to be part in the kind of, let's say, group which supports the policy in order to make this possible. So actors act as veto players. Then there are certain complications in the sense there is a European Commission out there which somehow would like to monitor what they are doing there. And this monitoring is modeled as a fixed enforcement cost, which says that to a certain extent the Commission may not want to step in since enforcement is costly. The Commission has to spend some resources in a field, and it may want to, it can only spend its resources one time. So if you have, let's say, 10 cases and you can only handle 4, since your day is 8 hours, you have only a day of 8 hours and you have only 5 days a week, then you have to make a choice. And this reflected in a fixed enforcement cost so that the Commission only picks out those cases which are more extreme. And finally, the assumption there is that the Commission will challenge the government and it is between the directive and the national implementation exceeds these enforcement costs. So what comes out of this little model? Again, shall explain very briefly the symbols first. Here we do not talk about N1 and N2, but we talk about now, let's say, the groups within a national context. So N is here the government, the one which was represented at first in the decision making in Brussels, but now it's here the one who has to take the decision. And N is faced with all kinds of groups in society, groups which are important or in parliament, and act as veto players. Here's group 1, and this is group 2. What these groups are is something you can fill in yourself. It could be, let's say, the Netherlands in Germany, it could be the labor unions in the Netherlands, and it could be something else in another country. D is supposed to be the contents of the directive, while the C indicates these enforcement costs, which basically defines a certain area where the Commission won't step in and challenge the government because it's not implementing a directive correctly. So, given the B's and the C's, you have an interval the minus C and the plus C, which gives this interval where you can deviate from the original content. Okay, now let's look at the G's. G1 and G2 are different here. They more or less oppose the government, but interestingly, given the fact that both groups encounter different sides of the government as well as the concept of the directive, nothing will happen because no one is able to push back the contents in a different way. The moment you would like to move the concept of the directive in this direction, you will have G2 as the veto player to oppose this. At the same time, if you move the directive in this direction, you will have, let's say, opposition by G1. So in these circumstances, one would expect that the directive is implemented almost as it's being intended to do so, to be so. Now we have a different situation here. Now the D's are slightly are here. The G's are at a different location. First D, he was here in the middle. Now the directive is here a little bit on the side. And the circumstance, and here my hypothesis is slightly different from some of the more, let's say, common sense notions on implementation. The moment these groups are found at one side of the directive, to the left or ultimately right, they have a joint interest of moving the contents of the directive slowly away from what was originally intended. So what you see here is our points, which all the groups and governments refer to the directive as the European Union has set, which in my view will lead to partial implementation in the sense that the directive will be reformulated in a different way than was originally intended. Only because all the groups, including the government, prefer to do so in the same manner. So to briefly summarize, full implementation only when the directive is found between the groups. Partial implementation is an effect of the fact that all national groups are actually preferring some deviation from the original formulation of the directive. And of course, deviation depends on the preferences and the enforcement process. So here, this factor, the two differences in policy are now a consequence of the preferences and the setup of the decision making at the national level. Right, now we have focused on two different factors. We have looked at the legislative decision making process, we've looked at the implementation process at the national context. So the question is, how does this come together and what does it say about diversity? Now, here I would like to indicate, first of all, diversity in the EU is a consequence of the legislative process, and secondly, it's part of the implementation process. And in the legislative process, diversity is a consequence, is determined by the national preferences and the different status cohorts. Consequently, and the fact that we have differences in EU policy is basically, in my view, also a condition of having a legislative decision there. I mean, you don't have a decision if you would insist on one uniform policy. So diversity is basically a condition for a legislative approval. Secondly, looking at the implementation process, it's a mixture of national incentives and enforcement costs, and there diversity, so differences in the way a EU policy is implemented, is basically a mechanism, we call it tailoring your common policy to the local preferences. The local is not necessarily of the local government, but local in the sense of national groups or subnational groups in the member states. Bringing this together, so now this is the final scheme. Bringing the two factors together. The common policy is decision making at EU level. Implementation, that's the component dealing with implementation, whether you have full or partial implementation. You can form this box with 4 cells. And interestingly, if one would like to research convergence, you have only one cell which makes sense. Then we are in a cell where the national incentives are such that basically disagreements on change exist in the national context, combined with not having the possibility of obtaining an exemption for a different way of implementing the policy. Only there you have convergence, and as a consequence, finally, a uniform policy all over Europe. And this is the box of MU, this is the box which is only rarely the case. The other 3 boxes are based on different kind of mechanisms. We have, let's say, disagreement at the same time, possibility of exemptions, we have possibility of change within the national context, whether you have or have not exemptions, and all those instances lead, of course, to what one may call partial convergence or differences in the implementation of policy, common policy in the national context, leading to finally a stage which one would call non-uniform implementation of policy. That is, having differences between the member states in the way they have drinking water directives, clean air directives, and all the other directives which we nowadays have in the European Union. Okay.